Alright, so today we're going to do our last video, Slavery by Another Name. Now this is something that I've studied in college. I read a book on it, and I thought it was really important to add this to Reconstruction. And I think you guys can learn a lot from just this short presentation, and then we'll actually watch a documentary that follows up on this stuff. Okay, so this is meant to be an introduction. I'm not going to cover a ton of information, but stick with me, have your notes ready, and we're going to copy down everything that's in red. Alright, so let's get started with the Bellringer. So could you explain the effect emancipation had on African Americans? And this is a really broad question, so you can take it a bunch of different ways. Alright, but I want you to try it. Explain the effect that this emancipation, this idea of becoming free, what did that do for African Americans? You could look at it positively, you could look at it negatively. Take a shot, okay? So that's going to be our Bellringer for today. And I'll give you a sample answer. This is not to say that this is what the answer is, but this is just one way of answering the question. So, emancipation allowed African Americans to be free from the chains of slavery and be considered legally free. If you wanted to add in there about the 15th Amendment and what that did for African Americans, the 14th Amendment with citizenship, all those things together, you could add that in there to make that a stronger answer. This is a very generic base answer. I expect that you guys can come up with something a little bit stronger than what I've written there. You could take the negative spin and talk about Jim Crow. You could talk about sharecropping. You could talk about a lot of things. Today, we're going to talk about something that really hurts emancipation, that really leads to what the author of this book, Douglas A. Blackmon, writes in Slavery by Another Name. He writes that slavery does not technically end until World War II. Now, that's kind of the end game. That's where we're going. But let's talk about that, okay? Because that sounds really radical, doesn't it? By the end of World War II, 1945, we're talking? That's a long time. So, let's get going. Here's a pretest. In here, I have some key vocabulary terms that we're going to need to know for the unit. For this particular video, you need to know this vocabulary so that you can understand what I'm talking about. So, right now, try to write down any of these that you know, okay? I'm sure out of these, maybe you can get even one vocabulary term. That's great. That's great, okay? But try. Give me your best shot. Try to answer one of these any of these questions that you know. All right. Now, I'm going to give you the basic definition of each. Your definition is probably pretty close to these, and that's fine. Okay, you don't have to copy mine. If yours works, I'm really happy with that, okay, because it'll make sense to you, and that's even better. So what is a convict? I just have someone in prison, someone imprisoned in a correctional facility, and that'll be key because we're going to talk about a system that relies on convict labor, okay, convicts working. The next is a tough term. It's called peonage, okay, peonage. And this is where people force you to work to pay off a debt that you supposedly own. So it's forced labor to pay off a debt. That's peonage. So that's like you didn't do your homework for 5 weeks in my class, and I decide, well, if you wash the windows, sweep the floor, clean the whiteboard, maybe I'll let your debt. I'll let the homework slide. That kind of bargain there. And then next is coercion. Coercion simply means to be forced. It's a real fancy way of saying forcing someone to do something that they don't want to do. To be coerced is to be forced. And then lastly is vagrancy. Probably this and peonage are the toughest on this page. Vagrancy is the crime of not being able to show that you are employed. And this particular crime seems really, for lack of a better word, kind of dumb. Why would you have a crime where you can't show your working papers? That sounds really radical. But In the South, this particular law, vagrancy laws, vagrancy statutes, were used against African Americans, and this was how they were able to make more convicts through laws like these. But we'll get into that. All right. So there's our pretest. This is the key vocabulary you need to know for the unit. So let's get going. I know this is a lot to copy down, but this is kind of the theme of what we're talking about. Okay. Douglas Blackmon is the author of this book, Slavery by Another Name. And in it, he's going to argue that slavery did not die after emancipation, meaning slavery doesn't end when Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, and he goes further and says it doesn't die even when the 13th Amendment is written that bans slavery in the United States, or involuntary servitude. It was simply replaced, and that's the key word, underline it, star it, write it in the biggest font you can, replaced by another system. And we're going to get into what is that system that replaces slavery in the United States. Hang on to the edge of your seat here. I know I'm getting crazy, but let's get going with what? African Americans who were in prison are forced to work, for no pay obviously, in places like coal mines, which is the most popular, and on chain gangs that fix roads. These are the two major ones. There's other places that they work. Sometimes it's plantation labor. But these two, I feel, were the biggest, and they represent what the convict leasing system really was all about. And so that's the system that we're going to talk about that replaces slavery, is the convict leasing system and the debt peonage system. So we got two today, two key vocabulary terms. But first, let's give you some pictures, some idea. Here's a chain gang. Here they're all working to break down the road. You see there they got their pickaxes, and then you got two whites on the bottom right of your screen. Two whites on the bottom right of your screen that are acting as overseers. And we talked about that with the plantation economy, that you had whites that were usually on either horseback or walking around, always checking on African Americans to make sure they're doing their work. Same thing here with convicts. All right, so you have that same idea going, except they're not on a plantation, now they're working a road. Okay. Here is a nice picture of what a chain gang looked like. Here they have their convict outfits on, the stripes going across. So this is a typical chain gang in the South. So, many African Americans were taken under small or even made up charges. So when I talk about vagrancy, the idea that if you don't have a paper saying that you work for the local diner or you work as a road builder, if you don't have those things, then they can charge you with vagrancy, and they can put you in jail for that, if you can believe that. A couple examples that Blackmon will throw out: talking loud while in the presence of white women. That was something that you could be put into jail for. Or riding in a freight car without a ticket. Now, many people are going to say, no, that's no way, that couldn't happen. It did. Blackmon has case after case where he goes through and says, yep, this happened and this individual was put into prison. This happened and this individual is put into jail. These things, these minor offenses, well, I didn't give you a total list. These are a couple things that people were literally put in jail for. So this is the way that the convict leasing system is able to get convicts to the jails. So this is how they get them. And one thing that Blackmon will argue is that there are a lot of young kids who don't have documentation of their age, and therefore, when they don't have working papers and they don't have any documentation, they're stripped away from their families and put into jail. And because they're not able to prove that they're, 14, 15, they're able to be snatched away and put into prison and put as workers. Okay? And here is a prime example of that. I mean, these are young. Young kids. That's like you guys going out there and not having working papers, and the cops pull you over, take you, and make you work out on the fields. You know, what are you supposed to do there? What can you do in a state of Jim Crow South where African Americans are persecuted? You got organizations like the KKK running around. It becomes a frightening scene to be African American or a person of color in the South after Reconstruction. Frightening. Now, there is an agreement in place, okay? Because for a system like the convict leasing system to work, there has to be people that will use convict labor, okay? The state is going to lease convicts to a company. So when we talk about leasing, it means to borrow, okay? They would lease convicts to a company, so the state's going to allow someone, the company, to take convicts from them for a monthly fee. So the state gives you labor, the company will give the state some money for that labor. So that is who these companies are: mining companies, sometimes plantation owners. Sometimes the state just used the convicts just to build roads. But this is how convict leasing works. This is how that system goes. So if I were to ask you to define the convict leasing system, here's a good way to show how it works. That convicts are being bought by companies to work for those companies, but the convicts aren't making any money. It's the state that's making all the money. Okay? So if you need to hear that again, rewind it here. I think it's a good place to help you really understand what the convict leasing system is. Okay? And so here's another picture we've got going on about the convicts. Here they are. They're working. In this picture, I believe that they're starting to mine. They're starting to build the mining part. So they're going in there and searching for different minerals. Now, here's the comparison to slavery. So in slavery, Southern whites, they didn't want their slaves to die, okay? Because they'd have to buy a new slave. That's how slavery generally works. You don't really want to overwork your slaves too much, because at this time you can't import slaves from Africa anymore. And so Southern whites are in a position where they want to keep the slave that they have, allow these slaves to have relations with one another, have another child that will become a slave, and let the system go on. So they, generally speaking, want to be nicer to their slaves. There's huge air quotes there, okay? But they want to make sure the slaves don't die, essentially. In the convict leasing system, that's not the case, okay? They can make more convicts by bringing up petty charges on African Americans in the convict leasing system. So if a convict dies, the company simply just gets a new leased convict. There is no incentive for them to treat the convicts well, because there's such a supply of convicts that it doesn't really matter. And the supply is ever growing. African Americans are continually pumped into the legal system. They're pumped into the jails. They're pumped into these places, and then they go out and they become workers for the company. They go home and they do it all again. That cycle. So that's why in this particular framework that Blackmon's arguing, the convict leasing system is almost worse than slavery, because there's no incentive to treat your slave better in this system. So it leads to overwork, it leads to disease, it leads to under feeding these people, under malnourishment across the board. This system is horrible. It is horrible, and it's under the radar. I mean, in your textbook, I couldn't find anything about it. I mean, that's how under the radar it is, okay? But I think it's worth your time to know. And so here's just an example of the terrible conditions. Here you have an example where an individual has probably tried to run away, probably tried to maybe rebel against his overseer. I'm not sure, but he's tied to this post so that he can't move, and probably out in the baking sun. And if you've ever been to the South, it's hot. Okay, it's hot. And this individual probably hasn't had no water and is going to be sitting out there all day, baking in the sun. Okay, and that's a torture technique. That's a terror technique that was utilized in the system. All right, and lastly, I thought we should hit on debt peonage. Okay, the convict leasing system, probably the most important, but debt peonage also worked as well. Although it would be outlawed in the United States, and it still is, the South would disregard this many times. So African Americans are forced to work for Southern planters under contracts that state that African Americans owed them money. So that African Americans own the Southern planters' money. Oftentimes, they never owed them any money, okay? But African Americans couldn't prove that. The courts were totally against African Americans. They were racist courts. And so they wouldn't believe an African American no matter what they said. And so what you have is whites just want free labor. They want the slave system that they had before. And so they're accusing African Americans of owing them money so that they can make them work on the fields for zero overhead costs. So it reinstates slavery in a different form, like Blackmon's arguing. So debt peonage, African American is quote unquote owes a Southern planter money. That Southern planter is able to recoup his lost money as labor. And so this corrupt system is able to flourish for quite some time. And it'll take a couple big cases in order for this system to die down, okay? But for a while, African Americans are just walking along and they're taken and forced to work on a plantation. Sounds very similar to what we talked about earlier about slavery and how that works. Very similar here. So this is the second part of Blackmon's argument. Okay, this is the second part of Blackmon's argument, is that debt peonage, along with the convict leasing system, work together to replace slavery in the United States up until World War II. So just to like resum everything, because I hope I didn't move too fast for you guys, but the convict leasing system and debt peonage are going to work together in tandem together to keep African Americans shackled in a state of slavery. It's the replacement for slavery, in Blackmon's words. And the system was widespread through the South and on a massive, massive, massive scale. I mean, the guy wrote a whole book and just goes through study after study after study of individuals who were writing to the White House, writing to their legislatures and saying, look, my son, my daughter, my grandchild has been taken. He didn't owe this person money. He didn't commit this crime. What can you help us? All these cries are not heard until after World War II and the FDR administration, who starts to make some gains in the civil rights movement. And so World War II, make sure you go look it up. Okay, when does World War II end? I might have said it in the video too, but when does World War II end? When does Reconstruction end? Can you give me a rough idea of how long this replacement slavery lasted? That's going to be part of your post test. So, for your post test, I want you to be able to explain what the convict leasing system is. You can go back through this video, re-listen to it, really have it down. Okay, what is it? How does it work? Who's buying convicts? Who's getting the money for the convicts? Explain that to me. Explain what debt peonage is. What's going on there? And for these, I don't want you to simply copy slides. I know you guys are all capable of copying slides. I want you to explain it to me in your words. If you were talking to a friend, how would you say, oh, debt peonage is blah, blah, blah. What would you say? You wouldn't just read off the slide, hopefully. Okay? Tell me what it is in your own words. That's going to be critical. I'm not giving you credit unless you give it to me in your own words. And then for the third question, it's kind of math related. So if you're good at math, I think you can handle this. According to Blackmon's argument that slavery did not officially end until the 1940s-ish, give me the end date for World War II if you could, how long would he argue true emancipation has been reached for African Americans? Okay? How long is it? Doesn't have to be down to the exact year, but give me a rough idea, okay? So that's your post test. Complete it. Make sure that anything that was written in red, you have it down in your notes. Make sure that you answer these questions in your own words. I'm not giving you the answers until we talk about it in class, okay? This is how you'll get credit for the assignment, okay? Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Hope you learned something off of this. We're going to talk about it in class, and we're also going to watch a documentary on it, which I think will be awesome. So, Slavery by Another Name, Douglas A. Blackmon. Here it is. Hope you learned something. Have a good one, guys. I'll see you soon.